Welcome to the folklore of the hawthorn tree. Hello my friends, welcome back to this series of videos I'm doing on the folklore and mythology and symbolism of various trees of Britain and Ireland and Europe. And today the whitethorn or the hawthorn or the May tree. Very important tree to our ancestors on these islands. So have you ever been wandering in a woodland in May and suddenly there's an overwhelming smell in your nostrils and it smells like, well, there's no other way to say it smells like spunk, it smells like cum, semen, or some people say maybe female genitalia, other people say corpses, rotting meat. You may be smelling the blossom of the May tree, which is very funky at this time of year. So very important tree, the May tree, really rich in symbolism in these islands. Sometimes it's said that the hawthorn tree is one of the three really sacred trees of Britain and Ireland, along with the ash and the oak and the hawthorn. And they're often found growing together, although not in this hedgerow. This is mainly dominated by hawthorn and willow, probably because there's a stream right behind me. So really interesting sacred tree, and has been for a long time. This tree is very strongly associated with the others, the little people, the fairies, the sidhe. So a lot of folklore about fairies. And this one I'm sat under right now is a really quite a big tree. This is about 30 feet tall. They don't normally get much bigger than this, so this one is probably quite old. They live for about 700 years, so a lot longer than say an apple tree or a birch tree, but not as long as say an oak or something like that. But they're fairly gnarly, they're fairly long-lived, these guys. Really beautiful tree. So this tree is also represented in the Ogham alphabet or symbolic system, the so-called Druidic tree alphabet or Celtic tree alphabet, where this tree represents the letter H or H. In some of the old texts, this is represented by the Huath or Huath. It doesn't mean hawthorn, it actually means horror or fear, which might tell us something about the sort of folklore of this tree. Something about the Ogham, not all of them can be connected to trees in antiquity, although they might be. There's a medieval text called the Scholar's Primer where the hawthorn is mentioned, and I think there's a kenning saying a gathering of dogs in the night or something like that. Quite fearful aspect to this tree. It's quite an ambivalent tree, but then in the margin, some medieval Irish monk has written Whitethorn tree next to the Ogham letter for H, Huath. So the letter H, this tree, and given quite negative connotations in the Ogham. And this is a tricksy tree, a bit like the Blackthorn tree that I've done a video on this channel, associated with fairies, but not always in a positive way. And if you know anything about sort of the folklore of the little people, as they're sometimes called, or the good folk, they're an ambivalent bunch. Sometimes they will help you and sometimes they will hurt you. So usually when you see a hawthorn tree standing on its own in a field or wild place, not so much in a hedgerow like this one, these ones are generally sort of not considered fairy trees, usually, not always. But if you see a hawthorn tree on its own, that is generally considered to be an abode of fairies, particularly at this time of year when they're in blossom. I remember when I was a kid, I remember seeing the hawthorn blossom move, even if there wasn't a breeze. And I absolutely knew, no one had told this to me. I can't remember picking this up in any folklore that I was told by old ones. I just instinctively knew that there were fairies living in the blossoms. And I would even tell some of my, close friends just with absolute certainty about the little invisible folk that lived within the blossom. that's interesting to me. I sometimes think that children maybe have a sense of the spirit world, which we lose as we enter adulthood, when we become a bit more sort of, I don't know, rational. So yeah, a strong association with fairies, this tree. It's considered really unlucky to cut down a hawthorn tree. It's considered quite unlucky to bring the blossom into your house. Uh, it is considered all right to cut the tree down in May, or prune it in May, not cut it down. So if you're going to take an Ogham stick from a hawthorn tree, do it in May, like I've done, if you want to go by the old ways of doing things. Obviously, this varies by sort of time and region. But the folklore is rife with farmers or landowners cutting down large hawthorn trees and experiencing ruin. Usually it's one of these ways. Normally their livestock dies, or there's a death in the family, or they'll be cuckolded, or their crops will fail. These are typical ways that fairies will do you in. But interesting, death and sort of sexual or marital discord in the household because of the associations of this tree. It's associated with sexuality and death. This could be because of the scent at this time of year. Smells like sex and rotting flesh. It's interesting how in folklore a lot of the times these things go together. Sexual gratification and death often kind of come together, which is interesting. I guess reproduction begats new life, which begats death. Maybe that's the connection there in a lot of the old symbolisms, not just in these islands, around the world. So in folklore, lots of people being done in by fairies when they cut a hawthorn tree down. Interesting that we also see this in history as well. There's quite a lot of historical records in the last 200 years of maybe a landowner buys a plot of land with a prominent hawthorn tree that is loved by the local people, and they ignore, you know, the old wives' tales and cut the tree down, and their house burns down or something like that. We actually have that recorded in history, that's happened a few times. Anecdotal evidence, you might say, but I find that interesting when folklore reflects actual history, or when they brush up against each other. There are some very famous hawthorn trees on these islands. Think of the Glastonbury thorn. If you're from Britain, you've probably heard of the Glastonbury thorn. It's a very famous tree. Was a very famous tree. It was supposedly it supposedly sprouted from a staff carried by Joseph of Arimathea when he visited the Holy Land of Britain, and he stuck his staff in the ground, and a hawthorn tree grew out of it that blossomed twice. It blossomed in May, but it also blossomed at Christmas time. So it was a sort of sacred tree in the Christian mythos. Really interesting, though, because it was obviously a very important tree to the pre-Christian pagan peoples, and this imagery of planting a staff in the ground and a hawthorn tree growing out of it seems very sort of druidic. It was probably a story cooked up by the monks of Glastonbury Abbey after there was a fire there, and they needed to bring in some tourist revenue. But really interesting that early Christianity syncretizes with druidic beliefs in this way, in the kind of folklore and the myth making. I find that fascinating. That original tree was cut down in the English Civil War by some angry Puritans. Really interesting that kind of thing still goes on today, because the tree was saved from a cutting and was cut down again by religious extremists in about 2010. Turns out that it was probably some evangelical Christians that didn't like the sort of pagan associations, or the fact that contemporary pagans were going there and tying ribbons to it, so they had to cut it away, even though that Glastonbury thorn actually emerged out of a kind of Christian mythos or myth making. I'll bet sort of, you know, admittedly sort of merged with kind of pagan thought maybe. When that Glastonbury thorn was first cut down, about, yeah, in 2010, I'm going to be honest, I was livid. I was so angry. I was imagining finding these fundamentalist Christians and cutting their legs off because they'd cut down this tree. And it was actually a Buddhist monk that I was sort of quite into listening his lectures at that time, and he was talking about the Buddha statues in Afghanistan that were blown up by another set of Islamic extremists in Afghanistan. And he said a really wise thing that's always stuck with me. He said, you don't blow up Buddhism by blowing up some statues of the Buddha. You blow up Buddhism by destroying the ideals of Buddhism, which is compassion and forgiveness. So if you get angry at those silly Taliban for blowing up the big Buddha statues, you've actually destroyed the morals of Buddhism there. I like to think that maybe whatever morals we have, if we want to protect the natural world and live in harmony with our fellow humans, maybe we can apply the same thing. So those fundamentalist Christians that cut down that thorn, they need to be forgiven for doing a silly thing. And that, some say, is the energy of the hawthorn. It's a loving, forgiving energy. Yeah, so the hawthorn tree, often cut down by fundamentalist Christians and religious extremists. It was saved again and was then cut down once more about 2 years ago by the actual landowner owning that bit of land in Glastonbury, probably because hippies kept going there and tying things to it. I have no idea what happened to that landowner. I like to believe perhaps he has fallen on hard times because of what he's done to that very important tree. It's interesting that this battle over sacred trees has been going on for hundreds of years, isn't it? You know, back in the Christianization of Germany and all these sacred trees being cut down, and then still happening today. A lot of the sacred tree, I came across one just the last video I made on dragons in the land and the legend of St. George. We came across a nice whitethorn tree on Dragon Hill there that had some ribbons tied on it. Normally, when there's ribbons on a National Trust property, the authorities come and cut away all the offerings and describe them as litter, which I just think is an incredibly reductive way of looking at it. Having said that, I really dislike plastic offerings being left on sacred trees. I find that a really dumb thing to do. But traditionally, like for hundreds of years, when you place an offering on a hawthorn tree like this, because this is something I'll get to, the hawthorn tree has a healing energy. Traditionally, it's thought of as a healing tree. So people would write their ailments on a bit of cotton cloth and tie it onto the tree. And when that cloth deteriorates, the illness will leave you. So it takes a little bit of time. Obviously, it won't deteriorate if it's like a poly cotton or a bit of plastic or anything like that. So I'm kind of all for authorities taking away the plastic, and I don't think people should leave plastic offerings on trees. Come on. But the authorities also take away actual sort of cotton offerings, which is clearly left in good faith, biodegradable and an actual spiritual offering. So for the National Trust or whatever authorities to come along and designate it litter and cut it away, it feels like a Puritan way of thinking still permeates some of our national institutions today. And I feel we're still fighting against that. There's a mass desacralization of the natural world happening today. Look at our polluted rivers, look at our polluted planet. And I think if we actually kind of allowed the sacred back in a little bit, maybe we wouldn't be having these problems. Anyway, that's probably a bit of a tangent. But yeah, this tree, in the old folklore, it often represents a kind of loving energy or a healing energy a lot of the time. And a lot of sort of folk remedies will be using the blossoms and the leaves and the berries of the hawthorn. And that is backed up by science. It's often used as a tincture in sort of contemporary herbology because it does a lot of good things for your heart and your blood flow, and it has a lot of antioxidants in it. It's an incredibly healing tree. So if you want to learn how to make tinctures out of hawthorn, that's not really my area. Someone else on YouTube will tell you how to do that. Maybe Danu's Irish Herb Garden. She's great. Check her out. I'll put a link there. When I was a kid, this was called a bread and cheese. The blossom is called cheese, and the leaves are called bread. It's sort of like a kid's foraging snack on the way to school. Doesn't really taste like bread or cheese. Tastes kind of shit, actually. There's other wild edibles I'd rather eat, but you can eat it. But much better as a medicine. So a healing energy to this plant, yes. But there's ambivalent things as well. There's darker aspects to this plant. At the beginning, I suggested that in the Ogham script, the letter, the Hawthorn, actually means horror. So that maybe hints at the malevolent aspects of this tree, which I've already sort of suggested with the sort of vindictive nature of some fairies if you mess with their domain. So don't cut down a fairy tree. It's also worth noting that illness back in the day is always caused by fairies. It's also worth noting that a fairy might come along and seduce your wife and husband and take them away into the other dimension, and you may never see them again, or you may see them 30 years later after they've spent a time in a underneath a hill in another dimension. So these very dangerous aspects of fairies, which may be associated with this tree. The other world also, it's sometimes considered a tree of the dead, often, especially when it's planted by water, like it is here actually. This is a liminal space, a barrier space, so a space where you might slip over into the other side accidentally. We've just had Beltane, and the May tree is a very important tree for this time of year, for May. Beltane just means May, Bealtaine. And that is a time of year, along with November, you know, just after Halloween or Samhain, where the veil between this world and the other world is thin. So the spirits of the Sídhe, the spirits of the fairies may be a lot more prominent now, but also the spirits of the dead. So the other side is a lot closer at this time of year. So maybe that's why this tree also has this negative connotations, you know, this connotations with the dead and the death. Historically as well, this tree would have been, it's not a particularly useful tree for building or anything, but the thorns on it are useful. They would have been useful for our hunter-gathering ancestors as fishing hooks. It's interesting to note on this that a lot of the time, if a fairy or an elf or some discarnate entity or demon gives us an illness, sometimes it'll be with a hook, metaphysically speaking. So maybe another similarity there, the hooking aspect of the hawthorn connected to illness, disease, and death. This is also a famous hedgerow plant, along with the blackthorn. Our ancestors would have used this as a barrier, a practical defensive barrier to keep out enemies, also to keep in livestock, but also a kind of ritual barrier, a boundary marker to say, here is inside, here is life, civilization, outside is darkness, chaos, and death. So maybe that's one of the associations with horror and death as well with this tree, because it's the boundary line where chaos dwells outside, civilization dwells inside. Perhaps dogs of war or wolves might be trying to find a way through the thick hedgerow, something like that. It occurs to me that if you're not from these islands, you might not be very familiar with hedgerows in general, because this is these days just a British and Irish phenomenon. Obviously it used to be in all of Europe, but a way of dividing up land using living hedges. Most of Europe and in the USA, I think you just use fencing now, don't you? But actually using a living hedge is still done traditionally here in much the same way as it was way back in the Neolithic, where they would have made enclosures for animals, or in the later Iron Age, where they would have been defensive formations. So it really builds into the symbology, as well as this being a barrier plant, as well why it has protective associations in folk magic You know, if you're going to make a protective amulet to ward off disease or bad luck, you might do it out of hawthorn because of these associations. Perhaps a bit of twig that you've harvested in May, so it's got that fairy energy to it. This is just in kind of folk magic practice in the last few hundred years, but might be quite old as well. So these are some of the things that hawthorn is associated with, or whitethorn, or May tree. The hawthorn is in blossom now, and as I said at the beginning of the video, this is a time you can cut it if you don't want to offend other little folk. So why don't you go ahead and do that and make a May tree? Very common custom in Britain and Ireland. It's like our equivalent of a maypole, where you'll decorate a bough of hawthorn in blossom, maybe with ribbons, and dance around it. Again, it has fertility sort of associations around that. So finally, a little story then about the hawthorn. As I said, there's lots of folklore about landowners cutting down solitary hawthorn trees and experiencing ruination. So I'm not going to tell you that, but if you want to hear that story, I've told it on my Blackthorn video. This is a slightly different story. This is from the Isle of Man, which is a very rich island, very rich in fairy folklore. And in this story, there was a farmer's daughter, and she was a good girl because she always left a little bit of bread or cheese or a little cup of milk or some flowers for the little folk, you know, in the fireplace or outside in the garden, just so they would do good things around the house because it was the right thing to do. So she was already tick in the good books with the fairies. Now, she got a little older, this girl, and started to think that it was time that she went to get some work to help mum and dad out. So she went out to some of the other farmers and knocked on a door, and a farmer's wife opened the door, and she said that she's looking for some work, this girl. And she said, the farmer's wife said, "Can you spin?" And the girl said, let's call her Betty. Betty said, "Yes, I can spin very well, thank you very much." And the farmer's wife said, "Good, you start today. Sew these 4 sacks of wool. I'm off to the fair, I've had enough." And she put on her bonnet and off she went. "And if it's not done by the time I'm back at midnight, you won't get paid." So she was looking at all this wool and thinking, how was she ever going to sew all this wool? You know, she had barely got through 1 sack and it was already starting to get dark. So she went out into that farmer's garden and looked at a hawthorn tree, and she walked around it clockwise 7 times, always saying, "Will you help me, fairies? Will you help me? Will you help me?" And on the 7th time, out of that blossom tumbled a little leathery, warty, brown-skinned little imp of a thing, a little brownie. And that little brownie said to Betty, for that is her name, "Go for a walk, but first of all, open the door of the farmhouse and say, 'Little folk, come in, I need your help to spin.' And then go for a long walk and then come back. And as you walk in, say, 'Little folk, thank you so much for your help.'" So Betty did that. She went for a long walk down to the sea till the moon was rising up in the May sky. And then she gets back to that farmhouse, you know, sun's gone down, and all the windows are lit, and she can hear this music. And she peeks in the keyhole, and then she opens the door, and there's about 100 little impish beings in colourful clothes, just sewing, so just weaving together all this wool in the most intricate patterns. And she says, "Thank you very much, wee folk, for your spinning." And she opens the door and they all trot out the door. It sounds like a very extreme mushroom trip I had once. And they present her with this beautiful white shawl that's all for her. Well, just at that moment, the farmer's wife comes in. All the fairies have skipped off, and she sees all this work is done, and she's quite astonished because she knew that there was too much work for that girl to do because she didn't want to pay her any money. And she's very cross, and she says, "Have you let the wee folk in here? Look at these patterns, they're all weird." And Betty says, "Yes, but look at all the work I've done." And she said, "Well, you've let some of the little folk in here, you're not getting paid, and give me that shawl. You can't have it, it's too nice for you." And she pulls that white shawl off little Betty's shoulders, but it just turns into cobwebs and May blossom. And then she's terrified and runs out the house. And little Betty, she scoops up all those May blossoms and it turns back into a shawl again, and she puts it back on her shoulders and leaves that farmhouse, never to return again. She didn't get paid, but she has a new shawl and knows that she has the blessing of the little people. Right, my friends, that's all I've got time for today. But thank you very much, my friends. If you want to see any of my other videos on tree folklore, then I will put a link to some now. And if you want to support me on Patreon to help me keep making videos like this, you're very welcome to do so. I'll put a link in the description. And if you are a Raven tier supporter, I may well send you an Ogham stick or a spoon. Reach out to me and let me know what you would like. Right, I don't know where my dog's gone, so I better go and find him. And I'll see you again soon. Ta-da!